because I am Michael Graham with Inside Sources, and I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation about America's infrastructure structure. Yesterday, the American Civil Society of Civil Engineers released their 2025 report. It's absolutely fascinating information. And one of the things that jumped out at me as a guy who has to cover lots of different things is that as soon as I heard about the report, I thought of roads, bridges, rail, that kind of stuff. But of course, they're also talking about the electric grid, which is something we cover a lot at Inside Sources because of the ongoing issues regarding electricity production, broadband access, which is another issue that's been debated, et cetera. And so we need smart people who can help us understand what is key in these new findings about the current state of America's infrastructure. And so we've asked a series of smart people to join us. Kevan Stone is the CEO, Executive Director at the National Association of County Engineers. Alex Muresianu is Senior Policy Analyst at the Tax Foundation, who focuses on federal tax policy. Ted Greener is Vice President for Public Affairs at the Association of American Railroads. And Dean Franks is with the American Transportation and Road Builders Association. So we've asked each of them to start off with a brief kind of 4 or 5 minute overview of, from their part of the infrastructure world, what jumps out at them as good news and bad news, significant for us down the road. And then after that, we're going to kind of have a conversation among ourselves. And those of you who are watching from various newspapers, magazines, et cetera, are free to ask questions. We have a link you can use to submit your questions so we can make sure we aren't redundant, et cetera, with 5 people asking the same question. So that link is available in the feed here on our Zoom call. I wanted to start with Dean Franks with the American Transportation and Road Builders Association, so that we can start with kind of at the top of the wide part of the pyramid and narrow our way down. So, Dean, please go right ahead.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate everyone joining and happy to be a part of this. Again, my name is Dean Franks, Senior Vice President of Congressional Relations at ARTBA, the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. Our members build all facets of transportation, we represent all facets of the transportation construction industry. So folks like contractors, engineers, architects, materials providers, equipment manufacturers, safety folks, et cetera, public officials. And then our folks build all modes. So the majority of them focus on roads and bridges, but also build rail and airports and so on. We partner with ASCE on many ventures and congratulate them on. I know from working with them over the years that this is not a easy endeavor to put together this report card. And it's always a very helpful tool to take a snapshot of where we're at as a nation when it comes to infrastructure investment. So kudos to them for putting this out. I know a lot of hard work went into it. As far as what sticks out to me and some key takeaways from this year's report card is that I think as a whole, but although some modes better than others, I think we are moving slightly in the right direction. But what also jumps out to me is the identified levels of needs that still exist. Just for roads and bridges, we're talking about another $1 trillion of investment over the next 10 years. I think that's in addition to what we're already investing. So, the analogy that I'll use is that I'll brag for a second. I have 2 wonderful daughters who get straight A's in school, and they work their butts off, and they
Right.
have a grandmother at home who works with them. We're very fortunate to have in-home tutoring from her, but in order to do that, they have to put in a lot of hard work, a lot of hours, a lot of investment, is what it comes down to, investment of their time to get those grades. And so relating to infrastructure, we need to continue, and ASCE identifies this, we need to continue investing. The IIJA, the infrastructure law from 2021, put us on a better track than we have been in a long time in this country, in making some investments, for highways in particular, or for example, it was the biggest year-to-year increase in highway funding at the investment or at the federal level that since the Eisenhower administration. So, but we need to keep that going. Just like my kids need to keep working hard to get straight A's, otherwise they're going to get lesser grades next quarter. So, we need to, as a nation, continue investing at these upward trajectories. Otherwise, these grades are going to slip back down. And, it should be noted, the highway number, I think, went from a D to a D plus. Bridges are at a C. We're still not exactly at the straight A's that my kids are giving. I hope someone picks this up and hears me talk about my kids so I can show them. But yeah, so I'll stop there, Michael, and turn it over to whoever's next.
Well, Kevan Stone is next. So, Kevin, tell us how things work from the National Association of County Engineers.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for having me as part of today's panel. Just a little background on NACE. Like you said, we're the National Association of County Engineers, and our members are comprised of whether they be county engineers, road superintendents, highway commissioners. There's a bunch of different titles depending on the different states you're in. Some of our members are elected, like every county engineer in the state of Ohio is an elected official, along with some based on population in the state of Nebraska.
Right.
So we run the gambit, if you will, in terms of duties across the country as well. Well, some departments only concentrate on roads and bridges. Others concentrate on wastewater, recycling, and more general public works, if you will. And we even have a few airport directors thrown in as well. So we're a little bit of everywhere in terms of what our members encounter on a day-to-day basis. And it's funny because Dean brought up his kids and grades. That's kind of where I was going to go, but in a slightly different manner. While the ASCE report card, and it is important to mention that many of our members are also ASCE members, and we commend them on the great job they've done again on this report card. And I know our members are generally supportive of all the efforts that they do this every 4 years or whatnot. But anyways, I look at the road and bridges scores, if you will, in particular, and then we have a C and we have a D plus. And I have a 9-year-old daughter who's in 4th grade, and if she brought home B's and D pluses, I wouldn't be very happy. And if her response was, "Well, it's better than last time, Dad," I don't think that would make it much better. But that's the world we live in terms of infrastructure. The report was very good to point out how the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act contributed, money that had not been seen before at record levels, whether it be through formula state funds or whether they be through direct funds accessible by local governments in terms of discretionary grant programs, the BIP program, STBG, et cetera, as part of Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And what I would tell my members at the time was, it's never going to be enough. We were very lucky that, every administration really has one or two main areas they can concentrate on before Congress flips, if you will, and then their agenda sort of is slowed down. And infrastructure happened to be what President Biden chose to move forward with during his administration. So we do have this record amount of money. But as the report points out, and again, something I stress to our members, this was at the exact same time that record inflation hit. And if a project was being awarded at $1 million for a bridge project in a given county, well, that $1 million does not go nearly as far as it did 6 months prior to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it just made those dollars that much more precious and that much more important to try and compete with others across the country for these dollars, because I don't know if we're going to see another Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act at the end of FY26. But we look at the report card and we see a lot of things we already know, and a lot of things that did not change from the previous report card. But I don't look at it in terms of just what the deficiencies are today, so to speak, in the road and bridge market, but what's being done peripherally or externally that could compound the problem and make it worse. And one of the things that NACE works on at the legislative level is truck size and weights. And if we look at the data from ASCE talking about the roads and bridges and fair versus poor versus good and whatnot, this is before any discussion of possible raising of truck weights, just as one example of many that are being considered sometimes by Congress. And it's fitting today because I know on that in the House today they had hearing on freight and the importance of freight for the American economy. Didn't really concentrate terribly on truck size and weights, but it's something to really take note of, that these numbers would have been considerably worse should that 80,000 pound number increase to 91,000 pounds or 98,000 pounds. CABT, Coalition Against Bigger Trucks, who we work with, just published a report earlier this week stating how much money that it would actually cost if these bridge repairs need to be done for the various increments of weight.
Right.
And it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So while we're very appreciative of the work that Congress has done, we're very appreciative of the report that ASCE is able to kind of judge what Congress has sort of done,
Right.
at least in terms of federal dollars. There are many landmines ahead that we are very weary of every year. With surface transportation bill coming up at the end, like again, September in 2026. There's things that we not only have to just advocate for continued or increased funding, but making sure that there aren't impediments along the way that could contribute to the faster degradation of county infrastructure.
Okay, well, that gives us some stuff to start off with in your section of the conversation. Excellent. Let's go to the world of rail and Ted Greener. Ted, what did you see in the report?
Well, first, I just want to say I have 3 daughters. So I think right now, if we put together our team, we got a starting 5 and a sub. So we're in good shape. Yeah, thanks. I also want to commend ASCE. I mean, they do a lot of work on it. From rail's perspective. So AAR, we represent primarily the large freight railroads. So those are privately funded companies, and our infrastructure is privately funded. But the rail grade actually entails all of rail, not transit. That's a separate grade, but it does include all classes of railroads, so class 1, 2, and 3 on the freight side. It includes passenger railroads as well, including Amtrak, which is a member of AAR.
Right.
It's not a controversial statement to say that if you were to bifurcate the report card as it relates to rail, at least in terms of passenger and freight, you'd have 2 different grades, with freight being higher, arguably, certainly higher than the B- that it received.
Right.
And I'm not clear on what passenger would necessarily receive. The only 2 infrastructure category types to receive above a C+, I guess you could say, would be rail and ports. And rail, unfortunately, actually did receive a downgrade from a B in 2021 to a B- in 2025. And we can get at that if you want to. I would frankly probably have some challenge, like some pushback on that. I mean, some of the things that were cited don't really have a ton to do necessarily with hard infrastructure. Track cause accidents, for instance, on the rail network are down considerably and have hit historic lows 2 out of the last 4 years. Also the incident in Ohio a couple of years ago was also cited as a factor. That was a horrible accident. Nobody should make less of it than that. I'm not sure that it necessarily merits any kind of downgrade, mainly because our private investment in the rail network has remained high over the course of the last 4 years when ASCE was looking at these infrastructure types in between grades. We average roughly $23 billion a year in private capital. And it's been the last couple of years north of $26 billion. So, the rail network in general, I would say, is in a good state, particularly as it relates to the movement of goods. But we'll just have to keep on working to get our grades up to Dean's daughter's level, I suppose. I would note too, and there's been a lot of discussion on highway infrastructure. I'd be curious if Alex takes, particularly, given frankly a lot of the challenges come down to dollars and cents.
Right.
But rail, probably to the surprise of some people on this call, care greatly about the state of our nation's highways and bridges. Our largest customer is the trucking sector. They happen to be our largest competitor, but they're also our largest customer. And so it doesn't behoove us or anyone, including the American public, for highways to be in anything less than a good state. Right. And so I'm hopeful that the bill that Kevin mentioned that comes up next year in Congress will be addressed in a meaningful way and won't be given short shrift in terms of continuing what are record investments. Again, how you pay for that is a key discussion to be had. And I think, the Tax Foundation and others that really engage in, and ARPTA for that matter, they engage in those discussions more than I would or do. I'm sure I have a ton of ideas, but projecting forward, it'll be an interesting 2 years. Clearly Congress has a lot to deal with, particularly this
Right.
year, right? I mean, reconciliation looms large, and whether that's one bill or two bills is kind of inconsequential as it relates to the transportation bill. But presuming that they get through that this year in a meaningful way, next year, there's only so many big ticket items, and this transportation
Right.
bill is one of them. And so, people on the call, for instance, that are interested in infrastructure are going to be maybe wanting to know that, and then also realizing that come next year you'll probably see more hearings. You maybe see draft legislative text, things of that nature that frankly are sausage making, but they do
Sure.
matter. They matter in how bills become law. And so we'll have our eyes on that, and certainly look forward to any of the discussion here to come. So thank you.
Excellent. And so now you can't talk about any of this without talking about money. And so we want to go to Alex Muresianu. Sorry about that. And first of all, you don't have to mention your children. I don't know that you even have any, Alex, but I don't want you to feel like any pressure, like you need to invent a family or anything to be part of this conversation. I don't know how this turned into Dad's Day, but somehow it did. So, Alex, go ahead.
You spared me from having to break the streak myself, as I do not have children to reference. Um, but
But if you did, they'd all be A students, not like this bunch of second raters, right? Exactly.
I don't know. I was an A's and B's kid, so maybe they'd be more like that. But yeah, I'm Alex Muresianu at the Tax Foundation. I'm on the federal team, so that's sort of where my head's at. We focus on researching and educating on stable, neutral, pro-growth tax policy. And certainly there's some sort of economics of infrastructure, and how we pay for infrastructure ends up getting included in that purview. I think it's worth thinking about, infrastructure, of course, is like a backbone, core input in
Right.
the US economy. But I think when you think about the growth from infrastructure, especially I think today with transportation infrastructure, there's sort of two ways to think about how infrastructure can affect, growth. There's a more sort of transformational effect, and then there's sort of incremental effects.
Right.
And I think from today, we're mostly thinking about incremental effects. The best way to sort of explain this is going from having zero interstate highway system to having one interstate highway system is a lot bigger, going to have like a lot bigger impact on growth and the ability to transport goods and services than going from having one interstate highway system to having a second interstate
Right.
highway system. I think that's a good sort of way to establish sort of baseline for how infrastructure affects the economy
Right.
and how what we fund. And that sort of incremental aspect where you're going to get, small improvements and on sort of maintenance and additional sort of marginal extensions of infrastructure, can help grow the economy. But it's important, given that it's not the sort of transformational thing, it's important to think about how we pay for it. And user fees, are efficient ways to fund transportation because they align the benefits of the services being provided with the costs of providing them. Also provides some discipline for governments, where if you want to expand infrastructure someplace, if it is the sort of infrastructure project that is going to produce benefits for people in the United States, then it's going to be something that people are going to use, and that will create revenue to help pay for it. Also, the use of user fees can help prevent sort of discrimination between modes of transportation. If you have one mode of transportation that's heavily subsidized with sort of general tax dollars, and the other one is entirely financed with user fees, that creates an imbalance and leads to more congestion on the subsidized one, and sort of underuse or underutilization on the unsubsidized one. So with that in mind, I guess, how are we doing in terms of funding our transportation infrastructure? And I would say big picture, like we could certainly do better. And does depend on the mode of transportation, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was a sort of move away from that in terms of funding. We mostly financed that sort of by put that on the credit card.
Right.
And so, I think Ted talked a little bit. Rail is heavily privately funded basically. So that's not really an issue. Airports, they could be better. The taxes we have could be better calibrated to match the costs that different users impose, and the passenger facility charge cap could be increased and used to sort of replace some of those excise taxes, which aren't ideally designed. But airports were projected to cover about 90%, at least the federal level, of outlays with
Right.
revenues from excise taxes and fees. Highways are more of a problem. I think by 2034, tax revenue from at the federal level, less than half of the projected outlays on highways are projected to be covered by gas tax and other associated fees. We've had to transfer almost 300 billion from the general fund to fund the Highway Trust Fund in the past, I think about 15 years. And the main driver of this is the gas tax hasn't been increased since 1993. It's declined in half based on, after adjusting for inflation. And you also have the introduction of EVs, which haven't caused a huge problem yet, but
Right.
obviously, as EVs get more common, the use of a gas tax as a user charge for highway construction is less and less workable.
Right.
So the proposal that we've talked about as the solution is moving to a tax based on vehicle miles traveled. This would get rid of, in addition to increasing revenue somewhat, depending on what the rates you set, it would also eliminate the problems not only with EVs shrinking the tax base, but it could also, if it's adjusted for vehicle weight, better capture the increased maintenance costs that some of these, larger trucks, as Kevin was
Right.
talking about, these larger, sort of heavier vehicles have a sort of disproportionate cost imposed on the roads. Now, I have some other sort of ancillary thoughts that I also covered in a recent paper with some co-authors here. I'm sure we can get into them later, but VMT, the biggest issue at the federal level is highway funding, and the clearest solution is a VMT.
Well, we will get to ancillary thoughts, absolutely. But I want to ask you the broadest question that I can think of for the average person at home who's no clue about ASCE or whatever. Their question is, when will I see improvements where I live, where I drive, where, in the water systems that my town is? When will my community, which we're getting a lot of pressure to build new housing, but then you got to have sewer and stormwater drainage to take care of them, and the people are going, where's that money going to come? When am I going to see the real live impacts based on where we are, both in the report that came out yesterday and then the broader the infrastructure bill that was passed a couple of years ago? And let's start with Kevan Stone at the street level. Can we turn on Kevin's audio? Sorry about that. There we go.
Thank you. One thing I would say that I should have mentioned before, but it directly correlates into what your question is. It's important to note in terms of counties own or operate or maintain about 44% of the nation's road miles and about 38% of the nation's bridges, which makes them the largest single shareholder, if you will, than any other level of or sub-level of government. So it's a good question to ask, because counties have just such an overwhelming share of the responsibility, if you will. And obviously in rural America, it's a harder question to answer. And the reason for that is a lot of the IIJA programs were geared more towards urban areas. And they had some other non-roadway, but roadway aspects to it, like Safe Streets for All, that dealt with bike lanes and walkways and whatnot. But at the rural local level, a lot of counties are being forced to actually issue bonds or go out and issue bonds. A couple counties in California can only do it statutorily once a year or once every 5 years, and they basically have had to take out bonds in order to finance their infrastructure projects. Now, you drive along more the interstates, if you will, you do
Right.
see signs saying federal dollars have contributed to this project, EPA completion, et cetera, et cetera. So you do see things that are being completed from the time that the bill was introduced a few years ago to today. It does exist, but obviously, urban areas are growing, rural areas, exurbs, which wasn't even a term I'd heard of 20 years ago, now
Right.
exists, and the infrastructure is just not there to meet the increase in population. So when you talk about new housing and new developments and
Right.
whatnot, the road infrastructure alone costs money.
Right.
And these are not financed by private corporations unless you're maybe in the Dakotas and there's a large energy industry up there and they subsidize a lot of the roads to get their goods to market and whatnot. But whether it be a large corporation, whether it be the mom and pop across the store, every journey begins or ends on a local road, if you will. So it's just as important to make sure that the funding is there. It's harder for counties, especially smaller ones, to actually access this money because they're, for lack of a better term, competing against other counties and other divisions of governments, whether those be MPOs, regional councils, et cetera, and they just don't have the staff, know-how, or personnel to actually apply for the grants. So obviously you have formula funding, which is doled out by the states by formula,
Right.
of course, but it doesn't get to everybody. And that's not the fault of the state. No one's blaming the state, if you will, but it's just a fact of life where if
Right.
the county's not able to access this money directly, and some of them just don't have the ability to do so, the answer is you're never going to see a benefit of the Infrastructure Investment and
Right.
Jobs Act. I certainly won't go into politics, but a large part of Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act dealt with electric vehicles that Alex
Right.
was briefly discussing. You talk to my members in rural America, they tell me, quote unquote, we know the one guy in town that owns the Tesla. And so that money could be better spent, so to
Right.
speak. And there should be a little bit more discretion in terms of what can and can't
Right.
be spent. But to summarize or to bookend this so we can move on, we talked about truck weights, of course, before, and everything that's being done in this report card that has come out addresses what is today. It
Right.
doesn't consider what's tomorrow. Now we have the degradation of climate, if you will, and natural disasters
Sure.
are bigger, more serious, longer, more unpredictable, if you will. The report doesn't say, well, if this continues to happen, we're looking at this. Well, the heavier trucks is another example of that. You're not going to see any progress, quite frankly, unless there is a change in mindset into what needs to be done continuously.
Right.
Not with one bill, not with one infrastructure bill, not with one reauthorization that sets dollar and policy amounts, but in order for the general public to really be able to see and benefit from these programs,
Right.
there just needs, unfortunately, it's like everybody else, there just needs to be more funding out there and accessible for everyone to access.
So let's get Dean Franks' take on this about what will people see in the short term based on the spending and this report. And also, I know the area, I'm from that area where everyone knows the one guy with a Tesla. Of course, now they're all headed over to his place to scratch it up and set it on fire, but that's a different story. Dean Franks, your take on when people will start seeing changes where they live. Let me get Dean's mic on here, please. Oh, there we go. Thank
Did
you.
that work? Yeah, give me a weird error message.
I understand.
Yeah, so we do internally at ARPA, we have a team of economists that tracks, where the money's being spent, how it's being spent, et cetera. And we are starting to see the impacts of IIJA already. And I'm gonna try and share my screen here so we
Okay.
use a visual. I just sent the request. I think someone on your end has to
Right.
authenticate it, but I'll keep talking while we do that. Here we go. Yeah, you guys see that?
Okay.
Yeah. So this demonstrates the value of state and local government, and the federal money flows, as I think Kevin and others had mentioned, flows down through the states via formula, or to some cases via discretionary grants to the localities and sub-allocated to to the counties and towns. So, what we're tracking is, real increases in investment in both highways and bridge
Right.
thus far over the last 4 years. So to answer the question, Michael, folks should start, and if they haven't already, will start seeing those improvements to their local infrastructure. We've federal dollars through the first 3 years of IIJA have supported over 90,000 projects for highway and bridge projects across the country. And that includes nearly at least one in every single county. There's a handful of counties that don't have a IIJA project, but the vast majority of them do, and a lot of them have hundreds. And so we are seeing that. But the way that the infrastructure construction market works is that these things take time. It's the whole shovel ready is sort of a myth and something that is more of an antiquated and old time saying, because for better or worse, we're not using shovels anymore. We're using a lot of planning, a lot of heavy equipment that goes into building these projects, building bridges, building even average run of the mill repaving projects. Take time to plan and to carry out. What we're expecting is that we will hit peak of investment from the infrastructure laws. The investments made in the infrastructure law will actually come in 2025, 2026, 2027. Even after the law is expired is when you're going to see that peak from this law. And so I would say, the best is yet to come, and that, these things do take time, but we are seeing the benefits and we'll continue to see the benefits of this law already.
A quick follow-up before we go to Ted Greener. So when people say they've been working on this forever, I don't understand. They've been fixing that same intersection since 1937, or whatever. There's this bridge, and every time I drive on that bridge, what's really going on? I mean, is it just some things will never be right, or is it just the money just got held? Like what can an average person understand when I've lived in probably 15 different cities in my adult life, because I've had a lot of jobs involving mobility, and every city has the project that seems to never, ever be done. Dean? But before we go to Ted, I wanted to ask Dean about this. Sorry
about that. I thought you were going to Ted on that one. Look, I can't answer that, from the perspective of the state, but these projects are often multi-year projects, and just depending on how they're bid, sometimes they're done in phases. And so when they move on from one interstate or one section of an interstate, then they move down the line to the other section. And so, trust me, I get that frustration. I'm a Chicago native, and
okay. Well, Chicago is one of my cities. Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Every time I go home, 294, 290 is just constantly under construction, and that is just kind of, I think, a nature of how this works. Their projects are done in phases. Projects take a long time. So, I don't have a great answer for that one.
Well, I'm going to follow up that question for everybody in just a second. But first, I want to get to Ted Greener and ask you about when people who rely on rail, rely on trains, are going to see an impact. And, as you know, there's constant conversation in America, Ted, about commuter rail, and almost every time commuter rail is mentioned, there's, we have these freight rail lines that are either underutilized or formerly utilized, whatever. When are they going to be brought on board, et cetera? So once again, for people who think that there's going to be some moment where they're going to see a significant change in their access to rail, where are we really on that path?
Good question. I think the public's interaction with railroads, generally speaking, is at a grade crossing. The reality for the companies that I represent here at the AAR, well, it's largely a B2B sector.
Right.
And it's probably an unfortunate reality that, again, most of the public's interaction is when you're stuck behind a train at a grade crossing. Mm-hmm. The IIJA, the infrastructure law that we've been talking about, And a portion of the ASCE report card that we've been talking about touched on the issue of grade crossings. In terms of safety within the railroad industry, grade crossings is overwhelmingly the problem child. It is where the vast majority of fatalities occur. And the majority of all of those are, of course, tragic, and the majority of them are preventable.
Right.
So, the IIJA, the infrastructure law, I should say, included first of its kind funding for grade separations. And, Dean mentioned Chicago. Chicago, it's like the epicenter of the freight rail industry. And we actually have a great public-private partnership in there that I would encourage people to look up. And if they're in the Chicagoland area on this call, they're probably familiar with it. It's called CREATE. But those dollars probably, I don't know if they go as far enough for that, every average American can say, I've felt the effect of that.
Right.
But they are concentrated in areas probably where those grade crossings are most problematic, right? I mean, they're based on who applies for the funding at the state and local level. And so ideally, those dollars will continue to flow in ways that prevent motorist challenges,
Right.
on a number of levels. The best grade crossing is a separated grade crossing.
So what do you mean by separated? What does that mean?
Sorry, where there is quite literally no motorist and rail interaction, right?
So like a trestle, a bridge, a tunnel, something where you're someplace and I'm someplace else.
Yeah, you can either close a crossing and reroute traffic locally
okay.
around a grade crossing, or to your point, yes, you could build a rail bridge, you could build a pedestrian bridge, you could build a highway, a car bridge,
Right.
For cars and trucks. But so no longer there's no gates. We kind of have
Right.
three types
Exactly.
of crossings, right? You have one with no gates, you have ones with gates, and then you have ones that don't exist that are closed. So long way of saying, I hope that those dollars in the next surface bill will continue to be set aside,
Right.
and will go toward states and localities to partner with railroads to separate more of those crossings. I think that's really where the Joe and Jane will feel the effect of infrastructure legislation, and where the original point of this part of this discussion, at least with ASCE, relates, is that we can get those grades up, because that is frankly where, putting passenger trains aside, the key market deficiency exists. Sure. I'll tackle briefly your other part of the question as it relates to passenger trains. It's complicated. I mean, when I tell people where I work, their first question is like, oh, like, you mean you work for Amtrak? And it's like, kinda, but not really. And then the second question is, I went and studied abroad in Japan or Europe. Why don't we have high-speed trains?
Exactly.
It's a complicated question, but the reality is most of it comes down to population density and funding choices. Those passenger systems across the world are highly subsidized. There's not such thing as a profitable passenger rail system.
Right.
Railroads are, by their definition, capital intensive. You have to pour a ton of money into the network. We pour about one of every $4 in revenue that we earn goes back into the system. We invest, as the freight railroads, 8 times the average U.S. manufacturer. And that's kind of just like table stakes to exist. You got to do that. So the IIJA, the transportation bill, actually did include record funding for Amtrak. Amtrak has set records as it relates to passenger funding or passenger volume levels over the last 2 years. So I think actually they are seeing some benefits of that. I would venture, you have to ask them, but I think that they're seeing benefits of that. Again, whether or not that affects Joe and Jane day to day, I don't know. But we're certainly pleased with the starting point that was established with grade crossing funding, and just hope that those dollars continue to flow.
Okay. I want to go to Alex, and I want to ask a new question and go back around the board, starting with Alex and going backwards, which is about the money we're spending, and are we spending it the right place? You could argue that because the rest of our lives, tech, computers, everything, we're doing more with less. I can't write an email now without some AI trying to jump in and write it for me. And I don't do that because trust me, I'm more angry at the person I'm writing to than the AI will ever be. And so there's a lot of swear words they leave out and stuff. So I don't want, but in all seriousness, we're in the do more with less in so many parts of our lives. The tech gets smaller, cheaper, et cetera. And then infrastructure doesn't really work that way. In other words, the car takes up as much space as it takes up. If anything, it's costs more to do the same. Do you think the average American consumer is asking our roads, bridges, rail, et cetera, to do too much and they're not willing to pay for it? You mentioned the net revenue, Alex, from gas taxes, for example. Do people need to rethink the investment they need to make in order to maintain? Are people asking the infrastructure system we have, whether it's the sewer in their house or the interstate highway, to do too much for not enough money? Alex? Oh, there we go. Gotcha.
There we go. Yep. Yeah, so I think there are two angles to think about here. On the one hand, I think I mean, at some level, we're paying for the infrastructure one way or the other. We're paying for it with user charges, or we're paying it with general revenue. And you're paying for infrastructure for somebody one way or the other. But I think the principle of aligning the charges with the infrastructure that's being paid for makes a lot of sense. And I think in terms of priorities for how we're spending our infrastructure dollars, I think there's an idea that I first learned about reading through somebody who writes about sort of localized public transit, but I think the principle applies to national transportation systems too, is the ridership versus coverage problem. The example that this guy, his name is Jarrett Walker, explained, it was like you have a city and you have like a few buses, and you can either optimize for ridership, the number of sort of customers, ideally fare paying, customers who are on sort of one like main thoroughfare, the main street, going up and down the main street. And you run relatively frequent service there. Or you can optimize for coverage, which is to say everybody who lives in the town gets a reasonable chance at getting a bus once an hour.
Sure.
Within a 15-minute walk of their house or something. And so, these are both sort of frameworks to think about that people think about at some level when approaching infrastructure, transportation infrastructure at a federal level too. I am of sort of the radical belief that like ideally infrastructure is like supposed to be used. And so, ideally, I think there's you'd sort of try and optimize for ridership. That is where infrastructure is being used productively. But I think that is a trade-off that people see when they talk about services. Like I think Amtrak is a great example where the Northeast Corridor is very productive, very highly used, and in some years it can even run profitable, or at least over earn its operating costs.
Let's not get carried away.
At least pay for its operating costs. But then routes around the country, those are designed to optimize for coverage rather than ridership. And I think that's at some level sort of a subjective preference for policymakers trying to distribute the benefits of infrastructure. But at the end of the day, infrastructure is meant to be used. And I think that refocusing on user fees, I think, would re-level people's expectations there.
Real quickly, walk through how vehicle miles traveled fees as opposed to gas taxes would work. I'll be honest with you, as a generalist who does not understand these industries at all, I've always thought, why mess with the gas tax? It's pretty much it's basically user fee now. You go out, you buy gas, you drive. If you drive a big truck, you buy more gas. If you drive more miles, you buy more gas. I mean, it's pretty close. I mean, you can see other taxes where there's a disparity between use and revenue. It always seems to be there. Why would a vehicle miles be worth it?
Yeah, so I think as it's imperfect, it's pretty good. I would say I don't want to trash the gas tax too badly. Like I think it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Right.
Especially for your everyday passenger cars.
Exactly.
But even though we have some additional taxes that are targeted at some sort of heavy duty commercial traffic, that the rate at which the cost those big like those very big trucks impose on roads sort of rises disproportionately with their gas mileage. And so that's one way in which the gas tax and even the other excise taxes that we have that go to the highway trust fund, like the excise tax on big truck tires, do not match with the cost imposed on the system.
Right.
And then also, I think in the long term, the EVs, I mean, we're speculating about this, technological
Sure.
adoption of EVs, and you can read God knows how many reports from different
Mhm.
companies that say we're going to have, 60% adoption versus never going to get above 20. You can see people have those different
Right.
opinions. But, as that grows, that is also going to eat away at
Right.
the tax base for the gas tax. So I don't think it's a necessarily a bad, halfway
Mhm.
solution in especially in the current state, but you want to get ahead of it.
How would you actually measure it? How would I get billed for my vehicle miles?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different options, and it also depends on how much you want to integrate the what is like largely a state-based system for vehicle inspections and stuff that you could integrate that versus if it's a federal-only system. You can imagine a very simple level is just, when you go for your check-in, your vehicle inspection, you can like check
Right.
the odometer or something, and then that's how you find out your VMT. But there are also, apps today that that insurance companies use, car insurance companies use
Sure.
to track driving behavior. I think it's the Stop and Save system. The
Sure.
Progressive has one, State Farm has one. So that technology exists too.
Right.
There's sort of a trade, there's a trade-off sort of between low tech and relatively, at least from a feeling perspective, a
Right.
feeling of more privacy versus, people find more sort of digital tracking to be more invasive, but I think some of that can be mitigated. Some of it's kind of overdone or overhyped, but there are a lot of options there that you could implement a policy like this
Okay.
through.
Good deal. We're going to go to Kevan Stone now. I personally use my Signal app to track my mileage, and I also get my war plans there. So while I'm driving, I know where in Qatar or UAE I plan to invade. So it's very, very helpful as well. Kevan Stone, are the average Americans, are they asking infrastructure to do too much? Are they, as opposed to making the investment they need to get the service level they want? Let's go to Kevin.
Okay, it's a great question. First, when I give discussions around the country and people ask about VMT, I used to say there were a lot of privacy concerns, and then I would hold up my cell phone and say, "How many of you have one of these?" And they would all raise their hand, and my answer would be, "Well, the government already knows what it is." But alas, no, I don't think localities, federal, local, or whatnot, are being asked to do too much. I think at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, and that is just safe and reliable infrastructure that allows us to get to work, to get our kids to school, to be able to pick them up, to, just
Right.
live your life without a fear of catastrophe, if you will. Unfortunately, bridges are a really good example. When there are these catastrophic bridge events like you had
Right.
in Maryland or you had in Minnesota a while ago. It's amazing, and I don't mean to be trite by saying this, but
Right.
it really shows you how quickly infrastructure can get built if there's a real
Right.
want
Good
behind it,
point.
because those projects are expedited, for lack of a better term, and funding does appear. But I think of one of our members in Polk County, Minnesota, who borders North Dakota, Fargo area, North Dakota,
Right.
and he has what's called the Trail River Bridge. And I could ask 100 people what the Trail River Bridge is, and myself included wouldn't be able to tell you what that is. But it's they've not been able to secure the funding to be able to have it drivable.
Right.
It's not driven.
Sure.
It's impassable. And that would allow for industry to be more
Right.
efficient. It would allow for the transport of more goods and services. It would allow for, just economic progress, if you will. Is it too much to ask? Are those citizens asking too much to have
Right.
their bridge done? No, absolutely not. But it's a really great example of the funding just does not exist. Sometimes you're at the mercy of the state. And
Right.
if the state has other priorities, then your bridge doesn't get addressed. But what I do think, and I'm not referring to this particular bridge, but what I do think in general is I think counties in particular and localities, have been very transparent in what is structurally efficient versus deficient and how things are looking moving forward. And they've raised those alarm bells. And the funding, while increased, it's again just not getting to everybody. And we, unfortunately, as a nation, won't really hear about a lot of these incidents that could happen until it's too late, so to
So
speak.
let me push back on that. So we heard earlier that we had to take $300 billion from general spending
Sure.
to put into the transportation trust fund. That shouldn't happen because transportation is it's the gas tax.
Sure.
You use it, you pay for it. You get on a train, you buy a ticket. Obviously, for Amtrak, it's subsidized, but for freight, rail, you send the stuff or you don't. So you should be paying the cost. And yet we're having to dip into 300 billion. If you went back to your county, if the members of your organization went back to their county voters and said, yeah, we're going to have to add whatever, a half a penny to the local gas tax, or we're going to have to add a half a penny to the sales tax, whatever, because are they prepared to do that? They're going to say, no, you've just got to keep building me better roads and better sewer and better service at this price.
It's a great question, and we're making the assumption that every county has the power to do that, and
Sure.
they do not in many cases. They're restricted by their states of what they can raise funding for and to what degree. I own in my household, 2 electric vehicles. I'm not paying $1 towards the federal gas tax. Now, I live in Maryland. I'm paying a state gas tax fee when my car is purchased and whatnot. But like Alex and Dean, everybody has said, the gas tax has not been adjusted in 2 decades, if you will, and that money just doesn't go as far as it once did. And there's no real appetite in Washington to raise the gas tax. There was a lot of progress at the beginning of the Biden administration, and then when some media outlets really painted a picture of what increasing the gas tax would be, opponents phrased it. I mean, and the last time the gas tax was raised, the opponents of it raised it as the largest single tax increase in American history. And so obviously no politician wanted to get anywhere near that. There's just not the political will to raise the gas tax. And as long as people like me are having an all electric vehicle household, and that's not for any reason other than that's just what it is, the money's not going to be there. The money is shrinking. And every reauthoriz, as my colleagues will agree, every reauthorization bill that I can recall has had to be subsidized by the general fund, if you will. The gas tax has not supported a reauthorization bill, and I couldn't even tell you how long. So, it's going to continue. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, new money from the general fund. It's just, it is a subsidization, unfortunately, just because we're not willing to do what it takes to actually.
So, Dean, I want to ask you to add to this conversation, but also, and this will be another sweep back around, is there opportunity for new technology, new whatever, even new ways of financing that could help solve these problems? We see problems being solved, with AI and other things. And all. I saw the story today was doc in your pocket. That one of the solutions to the shortage of doctors is going to be AI plus handheld devices that will be able to expand the reach of a doctor's expertise, to places where the doctor can't be. So, is there, Dean Franks, something that the average person isn't aware of, but you're going to be hearing in the next few years that people who are trying to build roads, bridges, expand Wi-Fi and broadband, they're going to start doing X?
So I've been biting my tongue down here. I don't know if you could tell, but so going back to the revenue question, the truth is that at the state and local level, they raise revenues all the time for infrastructure. The gas taxes have been raised in, I think we're up to 39 states since 2013. And we have tracked election rates of the people who support those at the state legislature level and those who oppose them. And the reelection rate for those who oppose them is 91%. And for those that support them, it's actually 93%. And so the people who support these things get reelected at a higher rate. The problem has been at the federal level, as Kevin just stated, it's been actually 3 decades, to correct Kevin, since we've over 3 decades. 1993 was the last time we had a gas tax increase at the federal level. It's ridiculous, and so the support does exist at the local level, and when it comes to ballot initiatives, bonding initiatives at the state and local level as well. The success rate is continuously, every single election we track it, the success rate on those things is 70, 80%. passage, depending on the election. And so the support is there. The people understand that that we don't get anything for free, and that they're willing, especially when it's put to the voters directly via a ballot initiative or whatnot. They continuously understand that and support it. And so it really is, as Kevin said, a lack of political will at the federal level to deal with this, because they have that backfall of the general fund. The last bill that was entirely paid for with user fees was the 2005 authorization law. So we are going on 2 decades of bailouts. I think the first bailout of the Highway Trust Fund was 2008, 2009. And I think, as Alex said, we've now bailed out the trust fund to the tune of almost 300 billion, 275 billion, I think we're up to. So, and the next bill is probably going to be, barring some change in that political will, probably going to be more of the same. To your second part of the question on the technology for the construction industry, and I'll get into the pay for side in a second, but for the construction industry, we are seeing great advancements in technology. We are using our members are using all sorts of innovative and technology, whether it's via what someone consider AI or automation with equipment, with planning, how we design projects. There's so much tech that goes into that. How we inspect bridges, for example, we're using drones so that our workers don't have to get up in a boom mic and go 7 stories in the air. So there's all sorts of technological advancements in safety, around roadside construction sites and so forth. So all sorts of advancements there. Now, in the collection mechanism and in the revenue mechanism, the technology is there to do this. Again, it goes back to that political will. For example, on the truck side, every single truck, interstate truck in this country, tracks their mileage already. So we know that a mileage fee, at least on trucks, is very feasible. Now, a mileage fee on every individual car, there's roughly close to 300 million vehicles in this country, putting some sort of transponder to collect mileage. Now, a lot of the more advanced cars are already doing it as well. But generally speaking, doing that is very complicated and would have a lot of administrative costs. But the technology is there to do all of these things. I think, people have brought up EV fees. Again, at the state level, 39 states have implemented an electric vehicle registration fee or, point of sale fee of some sort. So the will is there to do that at the local level. I think that fortunately there is some progress being made up on the Hill on that front. I think we could see that if potentially even in the tax bill coming up this year. If not there, then in the next reauthorization bill. And that has been, at the state level. And I think if you get folks off the record here in DC, pretty bipartisan recognition that everyone should be paying into the system. So I'm fingers crossed, and with a lot of work from myself and others, we will finally get at least the EV fee part over the finish line during this Congress. But yeah, the tech is there to do all this.
Well, let me interrupt because we're going to run out of time, and I've got a couple of questions that have come in, and I want to start with you on this one, Dean, and we'll let anyone chime in who wants. And the question is basically regarding gas taxes versus EVs. What if we offset electric car subsidies, stop giving them subsidies, but don't charge a vehicle mileage tax? Would that net out? So would that net out?
In theory, yes, but that money for the fee or for the subsidy, the $7,500 tax credit at the federal level right now, comes from the general fund essentially. And so our estimates are that it's some sort of equivalent.
Wait, you said $500. I mean, we've seen subsidies of $7,500.
No, I said 75.
Oh, you
sorry
did. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, good.
So, yeah,
I'm just getting old. I don't have these young kids running around like you guys do, who are apparently prepping you for these meetings. I didn't realize that was part of the deal.
All good. No, yeah, $7,500, and
it's a lot of money.
The equivalent gas tax. So the average vehicle, average 4-door, car pays roughly $120 a year in gasoline taxes. So, you know, one proposal up on the Hill for an EV fee, Senator Fisher from Nebraska, Congressman Johnson from South Dakota have a bill that would do a one-time point of sale tax on EVs that would charge basically the 10-year equivalent.
Right.
And so that would be much less. You know, we're talking $1,000, $1,200 that would be much less than the $7,500
Sure.
they're getting. So if you were to even reduce that subsidy and deposit that money into the trust fund, sure, that could work. But I think, you know, a direct user fee is something that is achievable on EVs. We can do a annual registration fee on EVs that again 39 states are already
Right.
doing, and every state except I believe one, last time I looked, has a registration fee already. And so we can work with the state, you know, DMVs or departments of revenue to sort of piggyback off of those annual registration fees that they're doing at the state level. And I think the administrative costs on that would be fairly low to do one at the national level.
Let's go to Alex on this. Does the numbers work? Do the revenue pieces work? And are EVs going to be a big deal when it comes to the revenue side of transportation funding? Because they obviously aren't now. I mean, what's hilarious to me is all the talk about it. Then you find out, well, how many people actually own the 300 million registered vehicles, and what are there, like maybe 5 million EVs, maybe? So go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, we did a revenue estimate of that the Fisher bill, and you know, we found the net fiscal impact when you raise excise taxes that reduces some other tax revenue mechanically, but you know, that would raise our main estimate was about sort of 50 billion gross and 36 billion on net after
Right.
factoring in, you know, those the interaction effects with other taxes. And you know, that, I mean, that's real money, but it's not enough to you know, that covers the projected deficit in the highway trust fund in like just 2034. You know, there are, at least to date, there are bigger problems.
Right.
The fact that the gas tax has been increased, I think, it's a bigger driver at this point. Now, yeah, the EV subsidies, if you got rid of those, that's about like 100. Our recent estimate was $192 billion
Right.
over a decade. That's more real money. But I think that is being thought of. I mean, it's, you know, a general policy.
Right.
It's not specifically related to the trust fund. And you know, that's also geared
Right.
towards general revenue. The one thing I also just wanted to mention at some point is we're like, you know, and this is sort of natural. This is what I do. I'm a tax person thinking about revenue.
Right.
But there is the other side of the equation. You know, I grew up outside of Boston. My favorite ice cream shop as a kid had an ice cream flavor called the Big Dig.
Right.
And I didn't quite understand what the Big Dig was. I just know there were a lot of jokes about it when I was a kid, and I didn't, you know, exactly understand that, you know, but there was this
Right.
huge highway project that, you know, cost God knows how much per foot. But you think about, you know, a big conversation today is
Right.
in the context of energy infrastructure and electricity and how difficult it is to
Yep.
build energy infrastructure. And I think some of that can also apply to the transportation policy conversation of reducing sort of regulatory barriers and having some downward pressure on the cost side, as well as how we think about increasing revenue as
Right.
a way to make sure that we're got, you know, equal sides of the equation on revenues and costs.
So let's finish up with this because we're running out of time, and we'll start with you, Alex, since you're on. Then we'll go around and wrap up with Ted Greener, which is the thing that when you look at where America's infrastructure is, whether it's from the letter grade report yesterday or just from your knowledge of America and how it's working, the part that's concerns you the most, the part you say, I could see something really going wrong here if we don't do something. And I'm going to take the moderator's option and start with my answer. My answer is the grid. We do a lot of reporting in Inside Sources about the grid. And once again, if it's so obvious that a dumb guy like me can figure it out, it's a thing. And when you tell me we're going to electrify every vehicle, we're going to have massive data centers, we're going to electrify home heating in Minnesota and Maine, which heating by electricity is just wildly inefficient. It just is. And oh, by the way, we're going to use the current grid to do it. I'm like, okay, so when do the blackouts start? I mean, just tell me when I can plan on not having electricity, because I know where you can't simultaneously drop load, the base load generation of power with coal and natural gas, et cetera, and electrify everything and keep the lights on. So that's my answer. When I look at this report, I go, holy crap, is someone going to get serious about the grid? Alex, what part of the America's infrastructure concerns you the most?
I mean, I think that just from my capacity as somebody who works on tax, but I think the highway funding thing is strictly in the purview of sort of tax questions. I think the underfunding and separation of highway, costs and revenues is a big concern. Just sort of as a person who reads news and learns about general public policy, I would concur with your assessment of the grid. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of new. We have projected a lot of new demand forward,
Right.
But are we going to be able to build out the supply that we would need to meet it? And I know that there are a lot of regulatory challenges to doing that. So that's another thing I would be.
Kevan Stone, when your county engineers look out at their future, what's the thing that worries them the most?
Sure, it's a very easy answer, and that is the state of bridges across the country.
Okay.
You drive on a road, barring a possible, sinkhole or
Sure.
pothole, is one thing. But if you're traveling on a bridge and that bridge goes when you're on it, I don't, that's
Yeah.
as serious as it gets, if you
Exactly.
will. And we're just not keeping up with the world, if you will. We're just
Right.
not repairing it at the state we should. It's not being done at the expedience that it should. The funding is not. There are a million different reasons why it's not being done, but it's not being done. And it's going to lead to tragedy, as history has
Exactly.
shown us. And with technology comes more dangers. Are there easier ways to assess bridges now? Absolutely. A lot of our folks are using drone technology and AI
Right.
to assess bridges.
Sure.
But now that we know what the problems are, well, how do we fix it? And that costs money.
Dean Franks, what's the thing that the members of the American Transportation Road Builders Association worry about the most in the future?
To be honest, I think it's the funding uncertainty that we discussed here. How we generate the revenue to continue the good work that was done in the IIJA, bring it full circle to the needs identified in ASCE's report card. Those are daunting, and we estimate that to just continue investment levels for highways, bridges, transit, and highway safety programs, we're going to need roughly $250 billion, so $250 billion on top of, in addition to the user fee revenue that's projected to come in to pay for the next 5-year surface reauthorization bill. So that doesn't include all the other modes that ASCE identified and grid and everything else that we need to do. So it's a daunting task, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us.
Ted Greener, last word. Now, I know what your concern is, that every rail dollar available is that eventually going to be spent on a California high-speed train that's never going to work. So I assume that's your answer, but I don't know. What is it that the freight rail world worries about the most?
We have nothing to do with that. And we don't necessarily have to worry about rail because, our freight rail infrastructure is probably A grade. So I'd go to the highway stuff as well, and the bridges for that matter. And I would go back to something that Dean pointed to, which is none of this actually, it's all a math problem, right? I mean, the Highway Trust Fund is yet another fund, right? Another trust fund. And so frankly, in Washington, the discussion gets muddied and politics get involved, but it's really no different. It's just a different name than things like entitlements and Social Security. It's a math problem, and people smarter than me, like Alex and Dean and Kevin, can tell you what the math is behind it.
Right.
But it needs to be dealt with. And I would just say this is not an anti-truck exercise. They pay a ton in taxes.
Sure.
And obviously the railroads, like I said at the beginning, want a good highway system. But there's a real opportunity, I think, in this point in time to take everything we talked about here and say, okay, but we have a mode of transportation with electronic logging devices in the cab. Let's see how that goes. Let's see how we can help alleviate what is underpayment over there. Because whatever one thinks of, whether my mom or yours should be paying for their full use of the road, I would imagine most Americans would agree that large multinational corporations using the highways and roads and bridges in this country should be paying for that. So how do you remedy that? I think you have a real opportunity in this reauthorization package to at least try and broach that discussion and move the ball forward in some incremental way. You're not going to solve the problem, but at least you can try and fix it as a starting point.
Right. And then once you figure out what works and what doesn't, what's cost effective and what's not, then you can start looking at other passenger cars, whatever, instead of
That's
now
right.
you've experimented in the arena where it's most capable of absorbing the problems, get instant feedback. You can fix it quickly if you get something wrong, and then you can figure out a model that works. That's surprisingly smart, Ted. Did someone help you with that? Did someone give you that answer?
I didn't think of it myself.
I'm kidding, of course. And listen, I really appreciate all of you joining us. This entire conversation has been recorded. We will have audio, video, and transcripts for people who need it. We're easy to reach. Just email michael@insidesource.com for our journalist partners out there. And of course, we'll be covering this. But thank you again, Kevan, Alex, Ted, and Dean, for joining us here at Inside Sources for this very important event. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.